We want a measured approach, a moderate approach. The first step is recognizing and that this is potentially a problem.
This is the Transformational Life Consulting Podcast with Deepa Grandin, MD, where Christians like you get the practical support and tools you need to build your spiritual, mental, and physical well-being, and to guide you on your journey to health and wholeness based on evidence-based science and God's Word. I am your host, Dr. Deepa Grandin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to my podcast. I'm recording this from Denver, Colorado, where I'm attending the Lifestyle Medicine Conference. It's snowing over here, and since I spend most of my time in Abu Dhabi, which is mainly a desert, it's a nice change to see and feel the snow. I especially love the snowfall when the sun is shining through. On today's podcast, I have the privilege of interviewing an amazing mental health professional, Dr. Arlene Cooke. With October being Mental Health Month, I wanted to focus on an important topic, the impact of social media, smartphone on mental health. So for those of you who struggle or have loved ones that struggle with low mood or have been diagnosed with depression, anxiety, eating disorder, or addictive behavior, this would be a good podcast for you to listen to. Dr. Arlene will discuss some of the root causes that can affect our thinking, mood, and behavior. In today's day and age, our lifestyle choices, such as use of social media, being aware of electronic addiction, all of these actually do contribute or can aggravate underlying predispositions to having mood disorders. So a little bit about our amazing speaker today. Dr. Arlene Cooke is a U.S.-trained clinical psychologist. She earned her PhD in clinical psychology in 1996 from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She has accumulated over 25 years of experience working internationally with diverse populations across different countries such as the US, Ireland, Abu Dhabi. She pursued specialized training in dialectical behavior therapy through the British Isles DBT training affiliated with the Linehan Institute. She is a trained mindfulness teacher via the Oxford Mindfulness Foundation, utilizing mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and other evidence-based mindfulness interventions. So Dr. Cooke has a lot of experience working with adults and adolescents, especially those who deal with depression, anxiety, those who struggle with adjusting and coping, and also helps people with relationships. So she brings in a lot of knowledge and experience. So I'm really grateful for taking the time to be here and to talk to all of us. Before we get started, Dr. Arlene, first of all, welcome. Thank you for taking the time out of your weekend to be here and to talk to us.
Thank you, Dr. Deepa.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, what got you interested in clinical psychology, and why did you choose to train in DBT and mindfulness?
Well, yes, again, let me just say thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. It's kind of, my passion, the things that have kept me interested in this field for 30 plus years and had me traveling around the world. So what got me interested in psychology? I think I was one of those kids who, because of my experience as a third culture kid, moving to the States when I was very young, experiencing that sense of myself as an observer and a little bit of an outsider, I got to be really good about listening and paying attention and observing. And I think I've just ended up being one of those kids who, was a good listener for my friends. And I think that just led me to thinking about, this, there must be something about counseling that I might find interesting. And happily, I was able to major in psychology in undergrad at Vassar College. And after that, kind of stumbled my way into clinical psychology in terms of thinking, how can what do I do that actually lets me talk to people? And clinical psychology was the path that I took. And, over the course of my training there at Chapel Hill and my experience in private practice and in other settings, I often found myself really struggling to feel as if I kind of could help people in a really, in a really focused kind of way. I think I found that I was often unsure about what the right thing was to do. So, one of the things that drew me to DBT was that it was something that incorporated and integrated a lot of the approaches and work that I'd done in terms of psychodynamic psychotherapy and cognitive behavioral therapy and other approaches, but also took a very kind of new way of looking at things in terms of the adding in of mindfulness. Mm-hmm. And, in the way that it works is by focusing on, what are the skills that people need, life skills, emotion regulation skills that people need to help them just in the end, make life worth living. How can we help people develop these skills? So it's very solution focused, but it's also very much about relationships. And it's very much about not just do this, do that, but how to help yourself learn to approach yourself in a different way. And so I continue to be really enthusiastic about that approach and have been doing that now for almost 10 years.
That's amazing. So, Dr. Arlene, so you've been in the UAE now for, I think, when did you come again?
I arrived here May of 2016. So yeah.
Okay, so definitely pre-COVID. And you've had the opportunity of treating many different populations in the US, Ireland, in the UAE. So do you find that when you're dealing with different people groups, there's more similarities than differences?
Absolutely. We can't, well, I guess we can imagine kind of groups that might be different from what I've worked with. But I think for myself, when I first moved abroad, I was very naive in terms of, I think I expected, at least on the surface, people to be much more similar. And that was one of the things that was a real learning experience for me was, just that, for example, the difference between America and Ireland, both speak English, but they're very different cultures, very different approaches to things. I had to change how I approach things as a psychologist. But underneath that, in terms of what are things that people are dealing with, the core issues, depression, anxiety, relationships, conflicts, identity issues, all of those were very much the same, certainly between those two countries. And here in the UAE, again, thankfully, I'm able to do my work in English here because so many people speak English. But, I would say the vast majority of my patients are English is their second language, and they probably 80% come from Arabic backgrounds of various sorts, not all Emirati, some other backgrounds as well. And we still end up talking about the same things. Yeah, it doesn't matter what the ages are, the specific cultural background, people still struggle with wanting to connect to people in their lives, with not understanding themselves, with feeling low and not knowing what to do about that, with struggling with anxiety, with, lots of other issues in their life that, they aren't quite sure what to do with. And so thankfully, my training, has helped me be able to work with people from a lot of different kind of backgrounds.
Yeah, that's so true. Now, since the inception of social media in 1996, and, it's literally managed to infiltrate half of the 7.7 billion people worldwide, we also know that social network platforms have almost tripled their total user base in the last decade, from 970 million in 2010, and now it's passing 4.48 billion users. And this is even older statistics from 2021. In your experience, how has social media been shown to affect individuals' sense of self, especially when we're talking about adolescents?
And talking about adolescents and children who are younger than that, developing your sense of self is one of the crucial tasks of that part of our life, right?
Yeah.
And the challenge that I found is that adolescents are often, because they're often looking outside for, ways to, where to kind of hook their sense of identity. Yeah. And that's normal. That's part of the developmental process. Children go from relating to family to kind of looking to friends and other relationships to figuring out who they are to wanting to pull back and choose who they are different from maybe what they've been brought up to be or what they've been told. The way that social media interferes with that process often is by bringing in information that is just not vetted, that's not safe in many ways. Adolescents are wanting to figure out who they are, but when they're doing a lot of comparing maybe of themselves to people who have very little to do with them, and more importantly, people whose presence on social media is very curated, very specific. And so, you have this comparison of, this is who I'm trying to figure out who I am, and I'm comparing my insides to this very curated outside that I see. And then everybody on social media, well, not everybody, but there's a pattern where people are kind of following trends, giving, similar messages, and that may not be completely reflective of what people are really experiencing in their life, but these are kind of what's the themes that have gone viral or the content that people feel like they're going to get the most response to. So they focus on that. And then teens are taking that internally and assuming that is truth. Yeah. And so it really can distort a young person's sense of who I should be, what's okay for me to be, what is safe for me to be, what is honest for me to be. And they can end up being really confused.
Yeah, I think you make some really great points because, for one, they're not vetted, like you said. And we're seeing more and more about the body image concerns and disordered eating because they have this, especially for girls, I would think the tendency for focusing on appearance is so important to them. And there have been studies that have shown that kids that spend enormous amounts of time, they have that, real, almost like an abnormal focus on changing their face, their hair, their skin. Is that something you have seen as well?
All the time. I think, of course, the reality is that social media is how these days it's how teens communicate. Yeah. I won't date myself, but not having social media when I was growing up, I had to communicate with people in a different way. And when I was searching to figure out who I am, I was comparing myself to actual people in my life. And I didn't have people intruding into my life from the outside to influence that, for good or for bad. I'm not here to say that all social media is bad, but like anything, it can be dangerous. And when it comes to body image, yes, young women, although not only young women, I think a lot of times young men, the way that body image affects them is not really picked up on, right? But especially for young women, this sense of, how do I feel about myself physically can get easily pulled in one direction or the other based on what they tell themselves is what's normal, what's expected, what is healthy, right? When I was growing up, I remember having very clear ideas about how my body compared to other people's bodies, but that was a very distorted idea. When I look back on pictures now, I think, wow, I was actually pretty slim. That is not how I saw myself at that point. If I could go back then and tell myself, I'd be very happy. I'd be like, enjoy yourself, right? But people have this very distorted sense because they're comparing what feels true, which isn't often is not true, with what they're being told is true, which is also often not true, right? I was just talking with my husband actually the other day, and one of the things he picks up on is in the social media where you have young men talking about bodybuilding and that sort of thing, where there's a lot of false information that's sent out, and then young people get the impression that in order to have this wonderful masculine body, you follow these paths, and when then they can't achieve this because what's happening in a lot of these social media presences is they're using substances, steroids and other things. And so you have this false image of I need to look like that, but I can't look like that. So something's wrong with me. And then we start judging ourselves. And also we say that's what is normal, right? And for young women, yes, people are not even photoshopped. People are, starving themselves to kind of appear in a certain way and they're only presenting themselves in a certain way and, very specific snapshots of their life on social media. And then young people are comparing their whole life to these very curated snapshots. And that's where the danger comes in.
Right. Absolutely. And does social media addiction exist? And can this affect mental health?
I absolutely agree that social media addiction exists. I don't think it has to be an addiction, though, to be problematic and to be dangerous, right? In terms of the young people and adults that I've seen who've struggled with the messages coming to them from social media, most of them, I would say, aren't addicted. Most of them are doing things that are very average. When we talk about addiction in general, you're talking about a pattern of behavior where it's very much out of your control, where it's having real impacts in your day-to-day functioning, where you don't have the actual control to be able to say, I'm going to limit how I do this. Part of the challenge, I think, with social media, similar to food, when people struggle with eating disorders, is that this is something that we kind of need to do every day anyway. It's very hard to not be online, right? Just as we need to eat. And so it's about finding a moderate way of engaging in this activity. It's finding a way to do it in a healthy way. Yeah. So the idea is not to say people shouldn't be online or shouldn't be, accessing social media. It's a way that people communicate with others, that they can gather information, can, engage in entertainment, share things with other people. So there are lots that can be really useful about it. The danger comes when people, and especially when we're young, and teenagers, when most of their interactions are coming from this format, then it becomes something that blocks everything else out in their life. And then they're not getting additional information so they can say, okay, this is what I'm thinking, what I'm getting from social media, but this is what the rest of the other influences in my life are saying. And then I can compare and contrast. Now, when social media is where we spend all of our time, then that's where the danger comes in. Yeah. And of course, with young people, we know that many young people are spending, the majority of their time online. And part of that is because their brains are being hacked by these social media companies. They're getting, flashes of information. So they're getting, rewarded all the time by, new information, interesting, interactions. And so we know that a lot of these social media companies design the way that the information is provided to kind of engage with brains and keep them kind of coming back for more.
Right.
Yeah. And so as adults, it's really hard to pull back and to say, you know what, I'm putting the phone down. I don't actually need to pick it up when the notification goes off. Can you imagine for an adolescent when everybody seems to be, that's where I can interact with people and this is where my whole life is and everything everybody talks about is happening there. They don't have the self-control yet. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of FOMO, and there was a paper that was published, and it's not even a recent one. It was a study looking at Taiwanese youth, and they found, there was a significant increase in self-harm and suicidal behavior when they looked at those kids who had like that sort of an addiction type behavior versus those that did not. And even this, I'm going to actually quote this study. It was done by Sumter. I don't know if I'm saying that name right. It was a study done on human behavior, and it looked at, it was a longitudinal study of adolescents, and they looked at those who did not have any symptoms of ADHD at baseline, but with high frequency digital media use, they actually fit the diagnostic criteria of your DSM-4 for ADHD 2 years in follow-up. So there seems to be some sort of an impact with the overuse, like you were also mentioning, the lack of maturity, or even that sort of a discipline, or having that insight like, hey, how much is too much? And at what point do I quit? All my friends are using it. I mean, I've had people joke that you have kids around the table, instead of talking to each other face to face, they talk to each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You know, and what is it doing to their brains, and how harmful is it really, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, as you were saying, you know, there's a lot of studies out there that have looked at this topic, and it's a global phenomenon. So I've seen studies from Sweden, from China, certainly from the States, from the UK. And, you know, the combination, you know, the information, when we gather everything together, what it says is that it's generally about how much social media and how we use that. Yeah. So in terms of how much, you know, the studies tend to coalesce around the idea that, you know, problematic use is, you know, about maybe more than 3 hours at a time. Yeah. Or 3 times a day. So if you're sort of getting drawn into it for huge swaths of time, we certainly see that young people especially are going to, we're going to see impacts in their mental health in terms of increased depression, anxiety, suicidality, self-harm, because, you know, both kind of directly and secondarily, right? So part of what we know, you know, even before social media, is that the more sedentary you are, the more likely you are to experience low mood. If you're on social media multiple hours a day, you're just generally very sedentary, right? And then also, we know then when you're not doing pleasurable activities that are nourishing for you on a regular basis, when you're not doing enjoyable things and having a mix of that, that's going to influence, and that is influenced by mood. Right. So if you're only on social media, then you're not getting up and going out and rollerblading, or talking to your friends in a different way, or playing a game in some way, or doing any exercise. Right. So there's a integration of the sedentary activity, the lack of other positive activities and influences in our life, as well as the content of the information that's coming. So when we're thinking about safe and moderate use of social media, we want to encourage kind of lessening of the amount of time that's spent on it each day. And then we also want to encourage young people, and everyone, adults as well, to think about how they access, not just how they access, but how they interact and engage when they're engaged with social media. So there's some studies that suggest things like people who engage in a very passive way, who are just taking in information and kind of scrolling, doom scrolling, especially when things are going wrong, that kind of engagement or lack of engagement tends to go along with lower mood, more anxiety, right? And so when you're just a passive receiver, that is much more problematic than if you're someone who is, you know, texting friends, or, you know, posting something that's really interesting and then engaging with people around that. Yeah. So we want to be more of an active user. We want to be more mindful of the way that we're engaging, and our tendency to kind of react and kind of going on into automatic pilot when we're engaging with social media, so that, you know, just because we get a notification, just because there might be something that somebody else is talking about, doesn't mean that we need to be going online ourselves at that moment. We need to be thinking about, oh, you know, is it okay to just leave it and come back to it?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I think you bring up some really important points about social skills, because the smartphones have been shown to affect how kids develop these social skills, and then down the road, how that affects their mental health. Because, like you pointed out, for most of us growing up, we had a lot more social interaction, spend time doing sports, religious services, or even going out to the park to play with our friends, riding our bike. And with the addictive nature of these video games, and even just the social media use, that face-to-face interaction has reduced significantly. And have you noticed that some of that could also impact the high rates of suicides and depressive symptoms we're seeing, especially in adolescent girls? Would you think that some of that has contributed to it?
Well, we know the main contributing factors to suicide in general and self-harm. Things like social isolation, certainly trauma, bullying, underlying mental health conditions. One of the some of the main difficulties in when we're engaging a lot in social media is that we're again, more at risk of being, having negative messages, taking on negative messages. There's a lot of cyberbullying that can go on, especially when you're a teen. And when you're a teen and a young person engaging in social media, a lot of times even if you're communicating with friends, you're not necessarily talking, you are kind of sending something, or it's still very passive. And it's not, again, about learning about the other person or sharing information about yourself or doing something fun together. It's about almost that sitting side by side, looking at something experience. Yeah. And so again, there's the lack of social interaction. There's that social isolation that comes along with it. There's the messages that people kind of receive that said, this is the way you should be, you should look like, you should act. This is what your house should look like. This is what your friend group should look like. And then we do a lot of, people do a lot of comparing. Well, that's not what my life looks like. And this is what I'm hearing it should be. So then, of course, I'm starting to judge myself. And we know that, when we engage in a lot of self-judgment and that negative self-talk, that is going to really cause the spiraling down of our mood, which then puts us more at risk for thinking, okay, our brains then starts looking for shortcuts. How do I stop myself feeling this bad? Yeah, not even how do I feel better? How do I stop myself feeling bad? And our brain loves shortcuts. So, shortcuts are things like, I'll do this thing really, impulsively. Yeah, because it's going to make me stop feeling bad right now, self-harm or suicide, Of course, the challenge for anybody, not just adolescents, is the struggle with, as I was saying, negative self-talk and self-judgment. And it takes a lot of work sometimes for people to get to the point of recognizing that just because I'm thinking something or believing something or feeling something doesn't make it true, right? And when I don't have real life interactions with other people or feedback from other people to help me counteract maybe some of the negative things that are spiraling around in my head, I'm much more likely to start believing, my self-judgment, to start believing that, I'm the wrong size or the wrong weight, or my life in general is just pathetic compared to other people. And then if we don't feel as if we know what to do to change that, and we start to feel helpless, then again, kind of impulsive, options start cropping up.
Yeah, that's like a vicious cycle. Have you noticed that some individuals are more susceptible to mental health effects than others?
Of social media in general, or?
Yeah, in social media, with social media use.
I think the sad thing is that I think we're all vulnerable to the negative effects, especially when we don't have the insight or the understanding of kind of how information is being crafted and being directed toward us. But in general, I think for it's the same rules as for most other things, that people who have underlying mental health disorders or vulnerability factors, such as family history, genetic loading, who are in poverty or in social deserts, who don't have a lot of social support, people who are struggling, with academic stressors, work stressors, any of or all of these vulnerability factors can set us up to then start going down that rabbit hole when it comes to our mood dropping in response to social media use.
Yeah, and that makes sense because we saw like an even more significant bump during COVID because
Absolutely.
a lot of people had to
Absolutely.
online and social
I
media.
was just looking at a study that was comparing self-harm behavior in adolescents during the start of COVID compared to before. And the rate had been pretty even, pretty steady up to and before the pandemic, right around kind of 17% in terms of teens engaging in self-harm behavior. And then in the first couple of years of the pandemic, we really saw a real jump. So jumping up to 20+%. Yeah. And that's a significant jump. And, the possible factors that they're posited are, mainly about social isolation. Yeah. In addition to kind of not having access to social supports, not being able to engage in activities that usually give us that we find enjoyable, that are rewarding, being cut off from our usual sources of kind of positive, those things that add to our positive sense of self. Not being able to go to work, not being able to go to school, but in it again, isolation, when we are kind of cut off from the things that keep us rooted. I think that really led to not just self-harm, but some of the causative factors. We saw a huge jump in amount of depression, anxiety, young people going to psychiatric ERs. So, people were really, really struggling. Yeah, it was a mental health crisis as well as a physical health crisis.
Yeah, totally. So, Dr. Arlene, what kind of advice can you provide schools and even families in order to protect students from going down that rabbit hole? Or even if they have teenagers or have identified children that have the smartphone or social media addictions or have a negative impact from social media use, how can we, from one perspective, prevent as well as offer support to those who are already struggling?
I think, as with most things, the most important first step is awareness on the part of teachers, of parents, and not just this general awareness that this is potentially something that is dangerous. Because what we don't want is for parents, which, parents often do, to say, no, that's bad, so I'm going to stop you from using it, which has negative consequences. I've seen that in some of my teens. If you're told you can't go online, it's taken away from you, then you are cut off from your social supports, right? And your source of entertainment. So we want a measured approach, a moderate approach. The first step is recognizing and that this is potentially a problem. And then it's in an individual way, communicating with the young person, what's their understanding of how much they use, how they use it, finding a moderate approach to, okay, this is something that we can allow you to engage in because really you can't stop it. Not in the world that, the way that it is now, but asking the young person to start reflecting for themselves. What do you notice when you've been on it for a long time? Do you notice, I've noticed that you get a little more irritable or a little bit more snappy, or, what do you notice? What do you think? And of course, young people may not always have a great amount of insight at that, but we start helping them to ask themselves these questions. In terms of helping young people with this, I think it's again about moderation, setting reasonable rules about social media use. So one of the things that especially contributes to depression, anxiety in young people, especially around social media use, is they're being on their phone late at night and not sleeping, right? Yeah. So having some clear rules about, when the phone stops. And this is true for adults as well. Lots of adults have the phone right next to it, then the light goes on, and then they kind of half wake up, or they wake up in the middle of the night, and maybe usually you would just kind of be up for 5 minutes and turn over and go to bed, but you reach for the phone. Next thing you know, your sleep is interrupted. So adults need to be watching out for this themselves. With children and adolescents, we can set some healthy guidelines about, at this point, we stop. Yeah, at this point, the phone kind of goes away, so that you're not doing, which I've seen so many times, young people kind of on at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, answering a text or watching something, right? Because then you have the biological kind of drag on their mood. Yeah. And you have the irritability, and then things build on each other. I'm irritable and tired, so then I don't go to school, or I don't function well at school. Then I start to feel bad, and my parents are upset with me, and I don't really understand that. So I'm lashing out at them. And next thing you know, it's this whole big thing. Right. So everything kind of interacts with each other.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's, I think, really great information, because the lack of sleep, we know, is a root cause of so many different mental and emotional regularities. Yeah. So sleep is definitely disrupted when you have that distraction, which is so addicting as well. So really great points. And I think, addressing the adults, because our children do what we do. And if we are constantly on the phones and doing things, they're going to do the same thing. So we need
how are you modeling this? Right. Yeah. I see parents all the time, especially with young kids, and it's very sad to watch. They're out in the old days would be playing with their kid. Now they're on their phone while the kid is playing by themselves. And then you wonder why your 3-year-old and 5-year-old or 10-year-old by this time is wanting your phone all the time, because they see you doing this fun thing. So they want to do this fun thing. Right. So, if adults, and I see this, go out with my husband for dinner, adults, they're at tables with each other on the phone as well. It's not just young people. So it's very easy for us to say, oh, young people, but this is a problem, I think, for everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the idea of using it and setting it down sometimes.
Yeah.
Learning how to do that.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Dr. Arlene. You've shared so much great information with us. Are there any last words or thoughts you'd like to tell us before we stop this podcast?
Well, again, thank you so much for inviting me. I think my main thing I'd like to encourage people is to see this as a tool and think about how we use this tool in a healthy way. It can be a great tool for learning about the world, for learning about other people, but we need to use it as something that serves a purpose for us that is very targeted, and we need to engage in it in a proactive way rather than just kind of taking everything that comes at us and staying in this kind of passive receiver mode. Yeah. Think about mindfully engaging with social media. Yeah. Being aware of what you're doing as you're doing it, and recognizing urges one way or the other. And then reminding yourself that just because I feel this way doesn't mean I have to keep holding on to it. I can set it down.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. Now that's great advice. So thank you, Dr. Arlene. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks to all our podcast viewers. Thank you for taking the time to listen. And we hope you can use all this useful information to make a difference in your own life, as well as the life of your loved ones and your community.